Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you, Jeff.
Okay, great. So thanks very much for the opportunity. I miss seeing everybody and wish we could be all together. I really enjoy those conversations at lunch, dinner, and so on. But I'm just going to do a real quick update of what's going on in New York with Crab Bay and a couple other things. So if you could go to the next slide, that'd be great. So I think really nothing's changed in New York as far as our assay over the past year. We're still, one thing that this slide alludes to, but is not really true. We used to run ALD and LSD together. We no longer do that for reasons I could explain if you had questions, but we do run ALD separately with succinyl acetone, and I'll talk a little more about the numbers for that. And also we're running 3 LSDs here with MPS 1, Pompe, and Krabbe disease being the 3 LSDs we run. And this is just the assay itself. You can go to the next slide showing the algorithms. This is the algorithm for Krabbe disease. So like Kentucky, and a little bit different, we're using the CLEAR tool. And our first analysis through is just looking for 3 enzymes, and we use both a cutoff and the CLEAR tool to kind of point us in the direction of the positives. Generally, the CLEAR tool is what's picking up positives for us, especially for Krabbe. And the next step would be to run a 6-plex enzyme assay to get a little bit better use of the CLEAR tool. And we combine that with ALD numbers as well, which really fully utilizes the tool. And we determine whether we should go on for second-tier testing. In addition, we are running cyclosine that has recently been contracted to the Mayo Group, primarily because the instrument that we're using has a fair amount of competition for it now that we're doing some pilot testing here that I'll talk about later in my talk. The next slide, please. So this is a result summary. You've seen this slide, I think, now probably 15 years or so. So I kept the slide mostly for posterity's sake, and we're up to almost 3.5 million newborns screened now since starting in early 2000s. We've had 1,000 of those go for DNA sequencing, and about half ended up having low activity polymorphisms. The number of polymorphisms we're detecting, cases like that we're detecting, is essentially gone to 0 as a result of the changes in the algorithm and using CLEAR and the 6-plex tools. So that number of 463 really is a dated number. I'm not showing here how updates have really helped with the assay, and I can provide that information for anybody interested, and we have published on it. And those updates being with CLEAR and the 6-plex tools. But so the numbers here don't reflect that. So out of the 3.4 million, we have referred 571 babies. And then when we get down to the bottom of the pyramid, 46 of those infants have had high risk or were associated with high risk for Krabbe disease. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And then 8 were infantile Krabbe disease, and 1 was a late onset Krabbe disease case. And the late onset was a fair amount later, where the child became symptomatic and has been transplanted. So now just a real quick thing about the high risk. One of the things that I, for quite a while, was aiming to do was to help kind of what is a high risk case. And I think later today, this afternoon, we'll hear a little bit more about how we define high risk now. It has changed from what New York originally had set out, which was to use just enzyme activity from Dr. David Wenger's lab to determine the risk for later onset Krabbe disease, and that's been very much refined with now that we have cyclosine and how some of the information Dieter presented earlier. We can go to the next slide. So this is just a summary of our ALD screening. We're up to 1.5 million newborn screened, sorry for the comma. The referral rate is 96 positives in the 1.3 million, about 0.084%. So this test is actually really rare to find false positives. We maybe have 2 or 3 what would be considered false positives where we really don't have an explanation for the elevation of marker, the C26LPC marker, and we did not detect mutations, or in some cases where we have variants, we're really not sure of their significance. So I will qualify that though. We are always looking for symptomatic ALD patients, so we can really determine with a fair number of our cases where we may have variants of uncertain significance, but the markers are elevated and follow-up plasma, very long-chain fatty acids are elevated as well. So you can see, though, we got about an even distribution of boys and girls that have been detected through newborn screening with ALD. There's 29 other elevated newborn screens that were associated with other peroxisomal storage disorders. Then the false positives I already mentioned about. So the incidence rates I report here in the 1 in 15,000 range make the assumption that anybody with very elevated marker concentration in a variant in the ABCD1 gene would develop disease, which is kind of the common thought that people have. Time will tell how that really works out and how these incidents will play out. Next slide, please. So the other thing I wanted to give an update, New York's done some pilot work, and we're working with, some of these are tests that are leukodystrophies. So I just will give a quick update on what we're doing there so you can see this is really what's been competing for the instrumentation that we're running cyclosine on. You may have heard about it. We're doing something called Screen Plus. There's a website that's been developed for it by Dr. Wasserstein and her crew at Einstein University or Einstein Medical School down in the Bronx. And it's a consented study and is really looking at new disorders, and it has very much a long-term follow-up and the ethics side, ethics, legal, and social study type work that's being done, which I think is really meant to focus us or help us with understanding what families think about screening for some of these more, I'll call trickier or later onset disorders. We can go to the next slide, please. So the overall goals of this are to evaluate the analytical clinical utility of the assays, and we're really refining cutoffs. Over time, we hope to be able to use some of the information and put this into CLEAR. This will be a resource, kind of pending our resource capabilities to be able to help with this work. We're also able to look at third tier genotyping along with the second tier biochemical testing, and I'll show you a slide that shows some of the things we're looking at there. And we hope to, I think the big thing here that's really new and interesting is just examining the ethical, legal, and social issues. Is the screening acceptable to the general public, and getting a better feel for that, providing that kind of information. Next slide. The list of disorders we're looking at that are on the panel. There are 2 different screens that we are running. One is a marker assay where we're looking for elevation in marker, and that's for CTX, MLD, Niemann-Pick C. All the rest are enzyme assays similar to the Crab-A, where you have a substrate internal standard pair and you're running it with blood. To do all 3 of these tests, we actually use 3 punches of blood, so that'll give you some idea of how this is working. If you're interested in the details of these tests, please let me know. So those are all the tests on the panel. I think the next slide is just for questions, but I believe we're postponing those. Let's go to the next slide just to be sure. I left something out. Yeah, so questions, which I believe will be at the end of the session. Thank you.